Thank you. Thank you, brother. Love you too.
All right. What a panel we've got. This is going to be so exciting. So guys, each one of you has a unique relationship to what I like to call the duopoly of ideas. Most of the time in the United States, there's just two positions on something. Taking a step back, we used to have 3 media companies, and that was it. NBC, ABC, CBS. But even though we've had an explosion of growth in news companies, media channels, still, most media is only representative of a sliver of the possible ideas you could have about something. The left-right divide dominates the conversation, and it's hard to get ideas that don't fit squarely within one or the other into prominence. And I think every one of you on this panel has a unique relationship to this phenomenon. So I want to toss it to, first of all, Andrew and Joe, because you guys have utilized, in a fascinating way, third parties as a mechanism for taking ideas that were frankly unheard of and bringing them to national prominence. What are some of the lessons and ideas that you have about this concept?
Well, thanks, David. First, it shouldn't take someone running for president to have a new idea get out there, you know what I mean? It's not exactly an efficient mechanism. But I was talking to Glenn about the fact that people respond to Bitcoin very ideologically in a way that's not very rational or principled. And unfortunately, we're at a time in American life where as soon as someone says they're for it, then the other side says they're against it. We're getting more and more polarized. And that's a recipe for disaster in terms of innovation, in terms of having new approaches to our financial future. And it's one thing that I'm dedicating my time, as other people on the panel are, to trying to change that, where 62% of Americans don't feel like the duopoly is working and they want to move on from it, but they keep being told, no, you have no choice, it has to be an R or a D, even though the founding fathers were negative on partisanship, and you have a lot of people here, I have a feeling, who voted for Joe. Anyone here vote Libertarian?
Yay, thank you, thank you.
So there are so many perspectives that aren't accounted for in our media and our politics, and it does threaten to destroy us. But the people here give me hope, because I know you want a different approach that actually is about solving the problems of tomorrow instead of blaming someone for it.
Yeah.
Oh, and you make a great point about the dichotomy. And real quickly, on the campaign trail, I was asked, okay, so who's right? Donald Trump, who says that kids should go back to school, or Joe Biden, who says they should stay home, or Donald Trump without masks, Joe Biden with. And I said, neither is right. It shouldn't be the president making these decisions. It should be up to parents, teachers, and students. And I'm finding that with Bitcoin, although unfortunately with Bitcoin, you've got both Democrats and Republicans against them, but against it.
We'll see about
but you've got the Republicans who are saying, let's go back to the gold standard. You've got the Democrats who don't care about money at all, obviously by the way they're spending it. So when I was on the campaign trail, people would ask me, so do you want to go back to the gold standard? And my answer was, no, that's not far enough. Since when are monopolies any good? We've got to get rid of the monopoly and have free market money, just like we've got, we should be having free market everything else when you go buy groceries or clothes, whatever. So there's a thinking out there that it's either this way or this way, and there's no other way, or it's the two of them, the two of those parties against basically the citizens.
Yeah. So both of you have utilized third parties as a means of taking ideas and putting them into the mainstream. Now, Alan and Glenn, you guys have both leveraged independent media to do something pretty similar. I'd like to hear both of you kind of give your perspective on the role of independent media in overcoming this duopoly on ideas. And then, Alan, I'd like to hear from you how Bitcoin can play a role in this.
So yeah, when I first started getting interested in politics in terms of wanting to write about it and work in it, it was in the early aughts, and there was the emergence of what at the time seemed like something exciting, which was political blogs, what was called back then the blogosphere, a really cringy term. But at the time it was a little bit exciting, and the idea was it was a way of creating a separate kind of conversation, a different sort of conversation than the one that typically takes place within the corporate media. And for a while, it mildly succeeded. There was a different kind of discourse, a different way of talking about politics. And one of the things that you saw happen was, soon as the corporate media saw the success of it, first they mocked it and ignored it, that standard cycle, and then they co-opted it. And they started having blogs and hire bloggers and kind of brought them into the mainstream discourse, and it kind of evaporated. And what you're seeing now is, in a way, a reemergence of that same ethos, but in a much more vibrant and potent and ultimately threatening way. And it's in part because the public has validly lost so much faith and trust in sources of corporate news, and has developed a strong antipathy for them as well, that almost anybody who says, I stand outside of that structure and have something different to say, gets a hearing increasingly. I think, you could just look at the fact that I think the single most influential media figure in the United States is not somebody who's ever on NBC News or in the New York Times, it's Joe Rogan. And where does he fit on the political spectrum? Is he on the left? Is he on the right? He's neither. He's nowhere. He's just curious and open, and that is increasingly what people want, and I find that very encouraging. And I think Bitcoin is a really good window for understanding this, because for a few years when Bitcoin first emerged, there was this almost like reflexive hostility toward it. I think it got kind of ghettoized as this like libertarian currency, with apologies to Joe, that instantly means if you're on the right or on the left, it's something you ought to ignore, or consider fringe or worthy of derision. And the more you kind of look, the more baffling that becomes, because there's so many political and cultural and social dimensions to Bitcoin. It answers so many of the problems that so many political factions can't find a solution to, that it's almost baffling why there's a reflexive hostility toward it. But I think the more these spaces open, where there's an independent way of talking about things, liberating ourselves from this duopoly, you see an increasing level of acceptance, or at least interest in new technologies like Bitcoin. I know that's been my trajectory. I thought it was just this weird thing for people who wanted to make money. And now I realize all my causes of free speech and privacy and undermining imperialism are all served, at least in part, if not fully, by this new technology. But I think the reflexive hostility toward it is sort of reflective of this idea of how powerful that mainstream structure is, where if they can take anything and declare it marginalized or outside of the duopoly, many, many people, including ones who don't think of themselves as being within that duopoly, kind of get conditioned to reject it. But I see the trend very much in the right direction.
They tried to do that to Joe Rogan too, you notice.
Yeah, they definitely did. Soon as anything becomes successful or potent, it becomes threatening, and that's what they try and do. And they're going to do that to Bitcoin the more interesting it becomes as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm very much a product of exactly this new ethos that Glenn is describing. There's no way that I would have really been able to achieve anything that I have in this community, or have ended up here, were it not for really just like Medium and Twitter, basically, which now we kind of take completely for granted. I mean, probably in part because of, as Glenn was describing, the extent to which they've been partially co-opted. But it's still amazing to me, like, what they really represent, right? I mean, Medium is blogging really is not Medium in particular, but blogging is self-publishing without a gatekeeper. And Twitter is then broadcasting of really anything, but predominantly in my case, of that publishing, again, without a gatekeeper. And I think the really amazing thing, something that this community can absolutely be proud of, is that I am in no way atypical. I mean, even earlier on in my journey, I was accelerating my own education and making connections by people who'd done exactly the same thing. I think, if anything, it's weird to sort of be an establishment figure in this. I don't know if anybody is. I don't know if that even means anything.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on what you said about how they're becoming increasingly against it. And obviously, since they're talking about coming up with their own, but it's online currency, completely different. They don't understand how it works. They are threatened by it. Look at the $1,400 checks that were sent out. Now, if we were under Bitcoin, could Biden have sent out $1,400 checks? No, because With Bitcoin, you don't make the money out of thin air. There's a finite amount. You can't just go out in the back and print a bunch, you couldn't print $1,400 worth of Bitcoin for everybody. And so they know that that's going to take their power away from them to come up with all the programs they're coming up with.
Yeah.
For the record, I quite like the $1,400 checks.
We know you do, Andrew. Alan, you were actually, I know we don't want to get too into politics or UBI, but you were talking to me earlier today about how you think there's actually maybe a little bit of synergy there.
Sure, yeah. I was wary of this maybe coming up because, I don't want to just... I don't want it to descend into a debate about UBI. I'm sure that's not why Andrew came here, what he thought he was expecting. But
oh, sure it is. I'm sure it is.
But I think, I don't obviously mean to speak for others, but I would be surprised if it were typical of Bitcoiners to be all that supportive of UBI. But the point I was making to you is that I myself am not, but I'm very sympathetic to the idea, I guess. I think because UBI, I see UBI as being a political response, and at least it is an effort at a political response, and it should be given, and Andrew in particular should be given credit for that, but to a problem which I see as ultimately economic and which ultimately Bitcoin also solves.
Right.
I just want to agree with Joe that I think there is a response coming due in Washington right now that I'm actually working hard to try and keep from being something that pushes a lot of this energy and innovation offshore. So we all saw there's an executive order and they're coming out with a regulatory regime. Buried in the text of that was a timeline. They said that they want to have the new rules out within 210 days of that announcement. So the next 6 months, there is going to be a whole new set of policies where Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are concerned, and I think we have to make sure that they keep those rules on this side of sanity, is what I'd call it. And I'll say also, as an American, I want this innovation energy to stay right here in America if we can help it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you make a great point about this side of sanity, and that's what I'm hoping the Libertarian Party can do. A lot of people didn't realize this, young people, when I was on the campaign trail. I would ask them, did you realize that both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were against gay marriage just less than 10 years ago? And their response was no, and why would they do that? Politics. It wasn't the Democrats who brought about marriage equality. It wasn't the Democrats who brought about legalization of marijuana. It was the libertarian push. And so we hope to do the same thing for Bitcoin that we did for those, which is to talk about it in a way that it's people's rights, that we have the right to privacy, and that the government shouldn't be looking over every single thing we do.
Absolutely. So, without going back down the UBI rabbit hole.
Good, because, and by the way, I received an email saying that I was not to debate with Andrew Yang on our individual politics. So.
We can save that for after the panel.
Yes.
But I do want to talk to you, Andrew. Speaking of Joe Rogan, you've had, how many times have you been on that show?
I was on once during the presidential, but we've been in touch since then. We have a lot of friends in common, in particular Dave Chappelle, who tours with Joe sometimes.
Gotcha. Now, how do you see the sort of utilization of technology and independent media and maybe Bitcoin in doing the work that you're doing and sort of advancing an idea that doesn't fit within left or right?
I think the work that independent journalists like Glenn are doing, and Joe Rogan, you could put others in this camp, where they're intellectually open and curious and willing to be somewhat heterodox in their views, is what so many Americans and people around the world are hungering for, and they're being denied it by the corporate media, the gatekeepers, and the rest of it. And I certainly think that this ecosystem, look around you. This is a media company, it's a community, it's awesome. This is the beginning of an alternative that I think is going to grow and grow because the mistrust of the establishment is also growing and growing by the numbers. And what's fascinating to me is that your trust in media actually is very, very partisan. So if you're a Democrat, the trust level is at 69%. Democrats still trust the media. And some of you are like scoffing at that because like that seems really very high. Among Republicans, it's 15%. And then among independents, it's somewhere in between at 36%. But all those numbers are going down. So the question is what comes up to replace it? And I think that people like Glenn are doing their best to replace it, and it's just going to keep on growing over time.
Yeah.
Just on that intersection between journalism and heterodox politics, I remember the first time I ever became interested in writing about WikiLeaks was back in 2008, before anyone who knew who they were, before they had done their big Iraq and Afghanistan document releases. And what made me interested in them was that there was a small little article in the New York Times that said that the U.S. Army had prepared a classified report declaring WikiLeaks an enemy of the state and was planning on how to destroy WikiLeaks. And ironically, that document got leaked to WikiLeaks, which being WikiLeaks, they immediately published it on their site. And I remember thinking, any group that the U.S. Army considers to be that threatening is a group that I have a lot of interest in and I want to find out more about. And I've been thinking about that with Bitcoin as kind of a way in. Within the last year, one of the most vocal opponents of Bitcoin, one of the people most frequently warning of the dangers it poses to the prevailing order, is Hillary Clinton. She brings it up in interviews all the time now. And then recently, within the last 3 months, Donald Trump has been doing that as well, echoing a lot of the arguments that Hillary Clinton has for why you should regard Bitcoin as menacing, that it threatens the hegemony of the US dollar, of US power in the world, which of course it does. And on some level, I feel like, one way to communicate this is to say, look, anything that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump regard as menacing to the prevailing order is something that if you don't instinctively support, you should at least be receptive to learning more about as a reason why it's so threatening to the prevailing order. And I think that the key to making more people interested in Bitcoin, again, not just as a currency, but as a political movement, as a movement of privacy that enables free speech, that can undermine this infinite credit system that is at the heart of U.S. imperialism and infinite war making and endless war, is to take it out of the left-right framework, which is not that hard to do. I did 2 interviews, video interviews. The first person I chose on purpose was someone who calls himself the blockchain socialist, who from a very traditional left-wing perspective argues why left-wing social movements should be really interested in Bitcoin. For obvious reasons, you need to be able to plan and organize without the state hearing and monitoring what it is you're doing. And then I interviewed Alex Gladstein, and he talks about the ability of Bitcoin to overthrow the dollar as the thing that enables and fuels imperialism. And then you look at what happened in Canada recently with the ability of the Trudeau government to just freeze the bank accounts with no due process of anybody participating in a protest the government dislikes. And Bitcoin offers the ability to solve so many of those problems, which both left and right and everything in between should be really excited about. And I think that is the solution to everything. It's exactly what Andrew said. The reason the media is collapsing in terms of trust and faith is because people are sick of those this duopoly being served. Everything has to be favorable to one party or the other. And the more you can bring things outside of that, I think the more of a hearing you're going to get. And that's why what's replacing the falling collapse in corporate media is this part of the ecosystem of the media that is very aggressively and explicitly opposed to that.
Really interesting connection, by the way, really interesting connection between WikiLeaks and Bitcoin, perhaps an obvious one, I'm not sure, but is that they're both non-violent, right? So I'm sure there are many entities, let's say, that you would expect the likes of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and the wider US establishment to deem a threat in some however ill-defined sense. But it's especially odd that these are basically just ideas. I mean, they're basically actually even stronger connection between the two. They're basically just truth. These people are scared of truth.
Yeah, and I'd like to also build on what you said. Of course, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are on the same side of this because they're both on the same side of big government and power. And that's where, Andrew, that's where we have, I think, the biggest problem with third parties. And I think one of the problems that third parties have, besides the deck being stacked against us, is third parties are principled in their ideas. Now, I don't always agree with the principles. Like, for instance, I'm huge on the environment. However, I think the Green Party's suggestions are going to hurt the environment, not help it. But, Green Party, all about the environment. Libertarian, let's give people the freedom to do what they want. Andrew, I know yours is going to be very principled. I know it's new. Constitution Party, whatever. So we have ideas that we're trying to put out there to the people. But what the Democrats and Republicans do, they're like chameleons. And it's whatever the people want them to be, they will be and they will say. And I told people on the campaign trail, I understand why people voted for Donald Trump, because he comes along, I'm a businessman, I know how to balance the budget, cut spending. And yet he gives us bigger government than Barack Obama. So basically, they just read people and give us what they want. And so what we've got to do is we've got to, I hate to say it, but I don't want to say start acting like Democrats and Republicans, but what we need to do is we need to start listening to voters more and showing how, yes, we can solve your problems. Yes, we have the answer, rather than going around putting our ideas first. We need to put the voters first, not our ideas, not our philosophies, not our principles.
Yeah. Oh, how many of you all would vote for a third-party candidate if you had the chance, either independent, libertarian, or otherwise?
There you go.
Well, they all had the chance last year.
Well, I'm sure.
I was on the ballot in all 50 states, and can I mention real quick? A friend of mine said, a friend of mine went to vote, comes out of the ballot voting booth and says, yeah, there was Trump and Biden and then some named Joe Jorgensen. Who's he? So the problem, again, the media, they didn't even know I was on the ballot, but yes.
Yeah, the structural limits, you weren't in the debates and that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, that's the point I'm making, is that if you had that choice presented to you, you would take it. If Joe had been up there on the debate stage with Joe Biden and, I had to say his last name, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, a lot of Americans would have looked at Joe Jorgensen and said, sign me up. Because the fact is, we might be in for a Trump-Biden rematch in 24, and over 50% of Americans don't want either of those choices. And so if you had a third choice and it was presented to you and it was competitive and it was meaningful, that third choice becomes very, very popular very, very quickly by the numbers. It's one reason why they're so eager to deny you that choice. So I want to applaud Joe and the Libertarian Party for presenting that choice to the American people. And I wish you got your, you wish you were on that debate stage and got your just due.
So I want to take a step back here. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that each one of you have been called crazy. When you left the Democratic Party and started the Forward Party.
I was called crazy when I ran for president. But
yeah,
true.
In the Democratic Party.
Oh, yeah. It happened earlier than that, David.
So, yeah, I think that's an experience that all of you probably have. And I think that's an experience that all of you have in the audience. Like, most Bitcoiners have dealt with the experience of being looked at like they have three heads. When people talk about, I'm going to a Bitcoin conference, I own Bitcoin. People come after you. They call you an idiot. They say you're falling for a Ponzi scheme. They try to argue with you and explain to you why you're wrong. There are real risks, both material and social, in stepping out on a limb in advocacy or support of something new. And all of you have taken material risks. You left, The Guardian. You left a cushy, cool job where you were crushing it to go try to change politics. And, you were in legacy finance, and now you're here on stage. So I want to hear from each of you about the thought process of, wouldn't it just be easier to just shut up and not say anything?
No.
What motivates you to kind of challenge this so deeply ingrained duopoly when, as you put it, Joe, the deck is really stacked against you?
I read Animal Farm in 5th grade, and that changed me for life. when I learned some people are more equal than others, and then when I saw it happening in real life. And again, I was called crazy in the 70s for thinking that marijuana should be legal. I was called crazy in the 70s for thinking gays should have the right to marry each other. So absolutely. But no, I don't want to live in a world where some are more equal than others. And a lot of people have asked me, oh, you're a woman, do you have any women models that you're... No, I'm just mad. I'm just mad at the injustice. And I think also that that's where we fall short, is if you look at the movements that have gained traction, such as Black Lives Matter or the Me Too, they're talking about an injustice. And I think that we don't do that enough. But that's what keeps me going, and I feel very strongly about it.
Andrew?
My parents immigrated to the U.S., and I always had this deep sense of gratitude for their decision and for the opportunities that I had in this country. And I felt like our country's not doing well. Our country's really not doing very well. Most of you probably realize that. And so when I saw, it's what is your hair, baby? In 2017, when I started telling my friends and family, hey, I'm going to run for president, their response was, of?
Mine too, mine too.
You know what I mean? Like that's but I looked at it and said, I genuinely think I can help my country understand what's happening to it in terms of the fourth industrial revolution and the transformation of our way of life. And if that's your upside, that you can advance the condition of your society and help maybe improve millions of lives. And then the downsides were time away from my family, opportunity costs, and potential public ridicule or humiliation. And it seems like a pretty easy decision, at least to me. You know what I mean? Like, if you can help millions of people, you have to take that.
And may I add quickly, 3 of my grandparents are immigrants, and my grandmother used to tell me stories about the old country, where they took away all your money, and it didn't matter how hard you worked, everybody ended up the same. So again, I grew up with a real love of what our country started as.
I think this animates Joe too. This is my fucking country. I'm not going to let it go down the tubes without a fight. You know what I mean? Like, I love this country.
Wow.
David, I want to go next because I want to say something extremely dark that I don't want to end on, so Glenn can then say something positive. That it's also nicely differentiated from these positive visions. What motivates me is that I feel like I have a very strong sense of what will happen if we don't win, right? Over the course of my lifetime, digital surveillance has gone from negligible to absolutely omnipresent, as Glenn will know better than almost anybody. Obviously, everybody here can talk at length and be called crazy by their friends about inflation, about fractional reserve and
though the higher Bitcoin trades, I think people see you as less crazy over time.
That's true. Yeah, you do eventually get proven right. And CBDCs are coming. It's which I find quite amusing because I honestly have never even seen a coherent definition of what that actually means. It's more like an aspiration. It's a particularly dystopian aspiration, but there's an enormous amount of weight behind it. It will eventually happen. We will need Bitcoin as an alternative. I am motivated by contributing however little to ensuring that it exists as an alternative.
Yeah.
Say something happy.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm surprised that you're so sure that I'm not going to offer darkness. I'm not really accustomed to people expecting that of me. But I'll try. One of the formative experiences I had on this question of why do you take risks and why are you willing to kind of put yourself out there in a way that isn't always popular is when I met Edward Snowden in 2013 in Hong Kong. I had been talking to him for several months online, developing a journalist-source relationship with him, and he was extremely careful for obvious reasons that he knew at the time and most of us didn't, that the internet is a place where when you speak, there are lots of ears that you're not aware of that are hearing what you're saying, and so he was very careful, which meant I didn't really know anything about him. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know where he worked. I didn't know how old he was. I made him prove that he actually did have extremely sensitive documents, and he proved that to me, which is why I got on a plane and flew halfway across the world to Hong Kong to meet him, but I didn't know much else about him. And when I met him, I had this mental image in my head of who he was. I thought he was like this very kind of old, ragged, national security guy in his 60s who had seen it all and just like got to the point where he couldn't take it anymore, was willing to go to prison. And when he walked up to me and my colleague Laura Poitras in that Hong Kong hotel, he was 29 at the time, but he looked like a kid, like out of a video store, like 22, 23. And I was shocked, and I spent that whole first day trying to understand why would somebody like this, who has his whole life ahead of him, who had a very good job for Booz Allen, making a lot of money, had a girlfriend who loved him, a family that was supportive. He wasn't the kind of vintage case of this like disgruntled, alienated whistleblower. Quite the contrary. Why would somebody like that be willing to risk their entire life? Our working assumption was 95% likely he was going to end up in an American prison for the rest of his life. By sheer luck, he didn't, but that was the likely outcome. And he ultimately said to me, we know we're all going to die, and the only question really is, how are we going to live? And to hear somebody in that stage of their life who wasn't just saying it but was living it was a really profound experience for me. And one of the things that happened as a result of that work is it got a lot of positive attention. It won a Pulitzer. There was a film about it that won an Oscar. My life changed in a lot of ways that I never expected. A lot of doors flew open. There's a huge incentive system that's designed to kind of co-opt you. They offer you a lot of money to go to events. You go at these events, you're supposed to, sit in cocktail parties with people that you've accused of being war criminals, you believe are war criminals. And, suddenly all of these incentives are designed to lure you out of this kind of dissident space into a space where you're much less threatening. And I felt myself falling into that hole and realized that, if I ever fell into that hole, everything that I did would just become a job. I would now become part of this system I regard as decadent and toxic and destructive. And so I think probably everybody who stays outside on purpose has to at some point make the choice that you look at this system, the evil it produces, and you really do have two choices. You can either be supportive of or complicit with it, or devote yourself to trying to undermine and subvert it. And, when people ask me who's the happiest person I know, I always say it's Edward Snowden, even though he's in exile in a country he never chose to be in for 8 years and probably for the rest of his life, because every day that he puts his head on a pillow to sleep, he knows that when faced with the choice of who he wanted to be and what he was going to do, he made the right choice, and there's just no substitute for that in terms of happiness. So I think that's a really good motivation scheme.
I wouldn't be so pessimistic about the rest of his life. If we elect Joe, we can get him back.
Or Andrew. I think Andrew, too, is going to opt for the pardon.
On the campaign trail, I said I would pardon him, Julian Assange, Ross Ulbricht. I went through the list every chance I got, yes.
That's a good question. Yeah, Andrew, if you were president, would you support the pardon of Ross Ulbricht?
Of Ross Ulbricht?
Yeah.
No. All I will say is that there's a history of presidential pardons being given out as political favors in like the last day in office. And I think we should be looking at pardoning people who acted out of principle or service at great personal cost.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, as we wrap down, I want to thank each of you for being on the panel. Thank each of you for taking the risks that you just described in fighting against the duopoly, against the mainstream. Even if we don't all agree, I think it's really, really good that we have people like you and people like everyone in this audience who are willing to take a stand for something that the rest of the world calls them crazy for. So I appreciate it. Thank you guys so, so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Welcome back to the Marathon Desk, hosted by Bitcoin Magazine, here live at the Bitcoin Conference 2022. I'm Natalie Brunell, joined by some amazing co-anchors, Dave Portnoy, Ben Askren, Alex McShane. And that was a really interesting panel for me because I come from the world of mainstream news. They talked about media narratives and politics, and I gotta admit, I've been jaded when it comes to politics because I've interviewed campaign, elected official after elected official or someone who wants to run, and all of them make these promises and they never come true and the system gets worse. So I want to talk to you guys about that because some of the points were raised. Alex, what are your thoughts on mainstream narratives in Bitcoin?
In terms of mainstream narratives in Bitcoin, I think vote with your Bitcoin. These politicians are going to adopt it, bring it in to boost their platforms. That's great. Some of them, I think, time will tell, right? Whether they're a net positive for the ecosystem or whether they turn their backs on Bitcoin if the price depreciates. So I would just say vote with your Bitcoin first. Vote with your capital first.
Well,
and then turn to leaders in the space, right? Bitcoin doesn't have any leaders. It'll eat up all of these people.
Is it just me that I'm just super skeptical when it comes to politicians on either side? Like, Dave,
No, they're
what are your
trash.
thoughts?
Politicians are trash.
Agreed,
Like
100%.
one maybe out of 1 million have like good intentions, but left, right, they all stink. They all stink.
I know. I mean, I get really excited when one comes out and they're clearly orange-pilled, right? And they seem to get it, or they're doing their homework and they say that they're going to support Bitcoin. But I'm always skeptical because their actions speak louder than their words, like we saw with Mayor Eric Adams, right? He came out, he said it was for Bitcoin, but not Bitcoin mining. It was like, well, do you get
Wait
it?
a second. You don't
Yeah.
get it.
Right? Ben,
And the
what are
fact
your
of the
thoughts?
matter is to rise to a certain level where you get to an elected, you're just a puppet a lot of times for other interests. But yeah, politicians stink.
No, I think he made a great point. Whether it's the media or whether it's a politician, when you start getting to certain levels, people in power don't want you to get power, right? So they say, "Come with me. Here's what I'm going to do," or else,
Yeah.
right? Or else you're not going to take that next step up. And so I think that's like we see that happen all the time.
Yeah, I would say my two takeaways are one, I mean, the biggest thing you're seeing, even with the negative news about Bitcoin, is you're seeing people lend legitimacy just by interest, right?
Yeah.
But the second thing you're going to see is misinformation and attacks for people who are close to the money printer. For them, Bitcoin is not in their best interest, right? So you're going to get people like Glenn Greenwald, Andrew Yang, Joe Jorgensen, people who have been disaffected from that system, turn to Bitcoin as a safe haven.
Yeah, well, that happened to me because I didn't like how politics and media seem to be in bed together, and I didn't like it. So I came out because Bitcoin fixes that. Look, the next speaker is literally the guy who changed my life. He's probably the reason I'm up here. I read the Bitcoin Standard in 2019, went down the rabbit hole, and now I'm a Bitcoin anchor, I guess. All right. So keynote speaker next, Saifedean Ammous, author of the Bitcoin Standard, pretty much the Bible for Bitcoin. If you haven't read it, you have to. His speech is called, "Is Fiat Money Worth It?" I think I know the answer, right? And make sure to come back here to the Marathon Desk hosted by Bitcoin Magazine for more commentary. We're going to discuss the panelists. Make sure to subscribe to this page and like this video for more, and check out Safe's speech.
Nice.